TNT.
It's been a long time since we've chatted to our next guest, uh, Terry Wolfe, our man in Manitoba, up in Canada. What's happening, Terry?
It's good to be back. I always like to get both episodes in if I can. I would love if there's a third one, but two in a day is plenty, and we just always have more to talk about. So let's get into it.
We never finish our talking points, but there was this story that you found, which is interesting. Songbirds. It reminds me of the awful movie. I think it was called Songbird that came out. The propaganda during COVID. I watched it like a month or two ago. Absolutely horrible. But the story says songbirds, sharks, and many other migratory species are in decline, according to the UN. What's interesting for you there?
Well, what's interesting to me is just that they completely ignore. This is from Canada's National Observer, and they're blaming this on habitation loss, climate change, the typical suspects for what they want to talk about, but there's no mention of wind farms, these what they're, a lot of people just call them bird choppers, destroying millions of birds as they're trying to migrate. So they're going along their normal migratory routes, and there's these giant turbines that are chopping them up in the process. They don't mention that. We know that sea creatures are being deeply affected by the ones that are put out in the oceans. The things fall apart, they leak oil, they need a tremendous amount of maintenance. They sit out there and destroy the habitat in the oceans. And this is just, blaming climate change while they're creating the death traps for animals. And so we're having this, and then of course that is a feedback loop, right? So as the numbers get worse, they can then say it's an even bigger crisis and we need to build even more wind farms. And, this is all somehow still the fault of natural gas or something like that. They will never reflect and see that their policies are hypocritical and destructive and counterproductive, because they are literally, I think they're trying to create the cognitive dissonance that jams up people's thinking on this so that the problem becomes the solution to them. We have to increase this in order to fix the problem that they're creating. And then it becomes a cycle of doomsday solutions, basically, you could call them.
Yeah, I didn't think about the wind farms, but you're spot on. And also all the chemical pollution that these same globalist corporate entities are creating. I've had on the show, I always forget his last name, Robert something. He wrote the book Exposure, which was made into a film. I think Mark Ruffalo played him. And I read the book, fantastic book. I love it. I had on Michael Barone last Friday, and he mentioned, oh, he like basically said he liked the fact that I actually read his book. No, I read my guests' books, otherwise I'd feel like a fraud. But the chemicals, right, that are destroying the habitats, the insects, the animals among, and that whole nother. This could be an entire hour-long discussion. The electromagnetic pollution. Right.
Yeah.
And
5G.
radiation.
People used to talk about that all the time. Nobody talks about I haven't heard anyone mention 5G in a year, basically. But that used to be a huge talking point on how it was affecting birds and it was affecting bees and their sense of orientation and things like that. We should be doing studies on this as well.
Well, there was just the U.S. government. Was it the NIH? I think they had like 30 million in funding or something that to study the effects of cell phone radiation, and they stopped. I mentioned this a couple weeks back, and they're like, oh, well, let's not look into the radiation coming from cell phones. Let's do another vaccine, And so,
Yeah.
and speaking of vaccines, there is this. I mean, literally, Terry, every day, it's a total clown world. CBS reports today, and I got this from the feed of James of Grand Theft World Liberty Radio. Does great work. I should get him back on. He does great analysis. Alaska man is first reported person to die of Alaskapox virus. Exposure may be linked to stray cat. And the whole COVID thing, Jeff Berwick, right, of Dollar Vigilante and Acapulco, his opening talk, he thought, and I mentioned this yesterday, I think it's one scenario that whatever was in the vax might be activated, and that might be called disease X. But it's just nonsense. These, yes, I still believe in viruses and contagion, but I don't really, I'm not afraid of them, and I don't think there really are pandemics, really. Yeah, maybe you had the bubonic plague, yeah, way back in the day. The Black Death, I do think that happened, but I think it's obvious now that they're concocting all of this artificially because they just talk about these nonsense diseases that they're making up that don't even exist. Your thoughts on this, and have you thought lately about how they might advance with their biosecurity state?
Yeah, I mean, I find that the more they add, I mean, I always get asked about my handle Wolfpox. It's unrelated to all of this stuff. Alaskapox now, cowpox, mpox, all these different poxes that are coming out. We don't know what these really are, and we know that the biomedical security state has been captured, and that we can't trust what they're saying because lying with statistics is the game now, in climate change, in the same way they completely make up numbers for carbon footprints and stuff. They can label whatever they want with people's deaths. We've seen them, play around. I mean, we don't have to go over the whole history of COVID's reporting nightmare of labeling things falsely. But yeah, who knows what this actually is? The guy has an immune deficiency that could be from an mRNA injection, and then something comes by and triggers it, whether it's environmental or some other, time release thing or some natural thing that just starts happening to certain people. It's literally military technology. That's kind of the thing that we need to keep in mind. This is military technology that was classified. We still don't know what was in them. And we don't know which doses were which. That's another thing that I find interesting about all these stories is I know people who got 2 doses of the vaccine and had never had a single side effect. They reported not even feeling that normal sort of sickness and whatever afterwards. There's this period where you feel a little bit bad afterwards. They might have just gotten a saline injection or a completely fake dose. Other people have completely wildly different symptoms, but there could have been 10, 15 different things being shipped out. And, it could be a giant test where they know where these things are going, but we don't. The level of psyops and deception around the medical system today is to the point. That's why I don't even keep track of it, honestly, is because it's so abstract. It's so high above my head. It's military grade technology and medical systems, which is all, of course, private, people's medical information. So it's very hard to try to keep track of what's really going on anymore.
And there's this one line in the story. It says official, all right, some expert official. The routes of exposure in this case remains unclear for Alaskapox, although scratches from the stray cat represent a possible source. And you can see how they can link that then to climate change. Oh, you scratch you pet a cat, you get Alaskapox or Chicago pox or Mexico pox or whatever.
Do you remember that?
And then
I was going to say, do you remember that episode of Simpsons? They
yeah,
were talking about the fake pandemic they were going to create for the news, and
yeah.
they literally picked cats as being the vector for it, and so they were trying to scare people with cats.
This is it, and they're going to say, "Oh, you know what? We got to get rid of cats, right? Because once they get rid of meat, the only meat that's going to be left is like cats and dogs, and so they're not even going to allow." Like they emit too much. We got to call all the cats. And there's the emotional support as well that you get from having a pet like a cat and a dog. All right, time for our headlines. Be right back.
Now, TNT Radio News.
Newsflash! Now, without further ado,
for TNT, this is James O'Neill. Elon Musk, the CEO of Tesla and SpaceX, stated emphatically that Russia will not face defeat in its conflict with Ukraine. His remarks were made during a discussion on X Spaces, part of the social media platform X, regarding a Senate bill proposing additional U.S. aid to Kiev. The U.S. Senate, led by Democrats, passed a $95 billion international security assistance package, which allocates approximately $60 billion in aid for Ukraine.
Why not give TNT Radio a follow? We're on all major social platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Gab, and Getter. Help us get the word out as we cover the biggest topics of our time right here on today's News Talk. TNT Radio. TNT Radio.
Do check out again Terry's websites, wolfpox.com, winterchristian.substack.com. Check out his books, his socials. He was a guest on James Dellingpole's podcast. I think that's very cool. And so he's going places now. And just to consider those themes now, again, that we were discussing, the whole political story about the EU fascism that they hope we get to experience in 15 years, 2040. Now you've got this story about euthanasia, duo euthanasia. First it's euthanasia, now it's duo euthanasia, and it's like, why don't you just commit suicide with your entire family, right? It's Jim Jones type stuff. Now it's his former Dutch prime minister dies hand in hand with his wife. Dries and Eugene van Acht, both 93 years old, died as number of couples in Netherlands choosing joint end to life grows. They say, that the numbers are increasing, and this is absolutely insane. Just this normal, I read, where was it? Ecuador. Now Ecuador is making legislation to allow euthanasia. You're at ground zero there in Canada. We've talked about that before. And then the countries now are activating it, probably thanks to the same globalist entities, NGO networks, consulting companies, United Nations, the World Homicide Organization. And so this is crazy now in the Netherlands that for me, this is not, in no way is this normal. When I think about my parents, my forefathers, the stories that I heard, my aunts and uncles, it's like, I don't know anyone that, this is not a normal thing. What your thoughts on this new form of eugenics?
Exactly. This is the reason why it doesn't seem normal is because this is the new normal. That's the term they use after the pandemic and with this whole push is a new normal where everything we used to think was normal is now discarded. It's important to emphasize that this is the former Dutch prime minister. This is not just some person. So this is the kind of story that becomes an example. It becomes it could set a trend. It could normalize it much more than an average person doing it. And I don't know, I'm kind of baffled. I don't even know whether it's saying what I think it's saying here in the article. It says, although couples amount to a tiny percentage of deaths by euthanasia, 8,720 cases, or 5.1% of all Dutch deaths in 2022. Is it saying that 5.1% of Dutch people killed themselves? Or is it saying that of the euthanasia, couples are 5.1%?
No, I think 5.1% of Dutch deaths were couples killing themselves.
But that just seems outrageous. That seems almost impossible. I don't know. I would love to hear from somebody. If there's anyone in Netherlands who wants to call in and explain this to us, I would love to hear more about that, because that sounds quite shocking. Yeah, and then in Canada, you do see a kind of a preview of what they want to do, where they're advertising these deaths as being positive, that they reduce carbon footprints. They, save on so much medical expenses. Of course, our socialized healthcare system is a disaster, and it is so slow and inefficient and expensive. So you may as well just kill people and save taxpayers money. I mean, it's a sick death cult, and it ties in with the Green World Order agenda, where people are inherently evil. Plants, they're trying to starve plants by getting rid of the carbon. Plants need carbon in order to live, but it's just a death spiral on every front. And here you have sort of a celebrity example that they're, I guess, promoting as a good example that people can follow. It reminds me of Soylent Green. That was another thing there, where you could go to a facility and watch a beautiful video as they, kill you and turn your body into meat for other people to eat, something like that.
Yeah, and here it says that the numbers, again, although still rare, euthanasia of couples was first noted in the review of all cases in 2020 when 26 people were granted euthanasia at the same time as their partners. The numbers grew to 32 the following year and 58, almost doubling in 2022. So you see a clear trend there. You wrote another piece recently titled Cognitive Dissonance, Slander Machines, and the Bystander effect, which was fascinating. Tell us more about that.
Yeah, I've said before that I'm fascinated by the psychology of the end game. As things get darker and things start collapsing and people start panicking and becoming really paranoid, how do they manage these crowds and these entire populations? And one of the most important psychological principles that people don't think about is cognitive dissonance. That's where your brain tries not to think about something because it's uncomfortable, because you don't want to have to, you don't want to confront it, because if you did, it would mean basically you have to take action. It would open up this whole can of worms you don't want to deal with. So your brain just basically circumvents the facts that you are seeing with your own eyes, or that you're sort of seeing the dots, but you refuse to connect them. And one of the main ways that you create cognitive dissonance in public is to do something shocking and then lie about it very confidently. You can think about something like building number 7 on 9/11, which falls at free fall speed. Everyone who's paying attention sees it. And then they just come out and say that was just a normal office fire that somehow did that. It's so shockingly evil. It's such a blatant lie in your face that your brain doesn't process it. You actually, because then you would have to say, well, then they're lying, and they're lying to cover up something that they planned. And there's all these implications that start to unfold. And I remember back when 9/11 happened, I would try to point this out to people in my own family, to people that I knew in school or whatever. And their brains would, you could just see them shut down. They just didn't want to think, they couldn't contradict it. They just didn't want to get into it. And that's what cognitive dissonance is where there's something very painful that you don't want to deal with. And so you just ignore it. And what happens is that con men, or confidence men, that's what I argue in this Substack piece, confidence men take advantage of cognitive dissonance, because while you're sitting there trying to avoid thinking about something, they're acting very confidently, like everything is normal, and they're normalizing the situation and taking advantage of basically what is a blind spot that is created by cognitive dissonance. So really, evil and sort of a very sloppy, blatant act of evil in public can ironically create a blind spot in which they operate, and they get away with things, because if you wanted to call them out on their lies, you would actually have to then acknowledge this whole other conspiracy or this evil that's been happening. And so I explore this in the piece, how that actually works. You're under a spell that they control, and that effect wears off over time. And then you can start to question them unless they keep multiplying the lies and multiplying the evil. And so by now, that's why we call it clown world. Things are so upside down and so inverted that, people who do get it are now just saying the whole world seems like it's crazy and upside down. But those who are still under that spell of cognitive dissonance, they're shutting down more and more and more. And I'm calling for people to get over that, to call it out, and to, not be afraid of the backlash. And this also then combines with another important psychological principle, which is the bystander effect, which is, it's been proven that when something evil or shocking or an emergency, a crisis is happening amongst the big crowd in public view, it's actually known that people refuse to get involved. If the more people there are, the less likely it is for anyone to do anything about it. It's kind of very counterintuitive to what you'd think, just like cognitive dissonance. You'd think that people would, if something really evil happened and everyone saw it, we would all be outraged. We think that we're logical, but actually people get afraid and they shut down. And the bystander effect is when people all sort of agree that we're not involved, we don't want any part of this, and they just let it happen. And so if you're thinking about collapse scenarios, possibly tribunals, martial law, executions in the street, genocide, all the crazy things that could happen in a collapse scenario. These are important psychological principles to be aware of in advance so that you can sort of think, if you think of yourself as an independent person who doesn't go along with the herd, you have to fortify yourself against these reactions you might have to just quietly sit back and not say anything, be afraid, and not pop this bubble of cognitive dissonance that everyone else is in.
It sounds similar, doesn't it, to the big lie when people talk about Hitler and Goebbels, and you tell a lie so big that people, because most people at worst they'll tell little lies, or what do you call them, white lies, little lies, but they can never imagine themselves telling such a massive fraud and lie, and that means they can never imagine anyone else doing something like that, like the whole climate change doesn't really exist, or the whole COVID stuff, or the different wars that are going on. And would you say it's a similar idea to that?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's actually, ironically, the more extreme the lie is, and the more painful it would be to expose it, the more guaranteed it is, the more certain it is that a large percent of people will just go along with it, because the alternative is to bravely stand up and create a resistance, to not let it go, to not let them sweep it under the rug, to become a different person, essentially. And that's where it ties into your identity. People don't want to see themselves or become that type of person who's basically a target. Like, from your own experience, you get things shut down, you become a dissident, and they start to target you. I mean, there's all these real world implications once you start popping these bubbles that they create. But it's just very important for people to realize that evil can happen right in your face in a public setting, and the exact opposite thing happens than what you would expect. Is people are quiet, they go along with it, they don't even want to talk about it, they don't want to acknowledge it, and that's why they can then easily smear people who do talk about it as a conspiracy theorist, and that lets people say, oh, I'm safe, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I don't want to be lumped in with that crowd, they're targeted for destruction, I'll stay over here where it's safe, and I won't talk about anything, I'll be a good boy, and I'll shut up. And so it's a very important part of the end game, I think, going forward.
Yeah, and I think many of us have experienced this in different ways growing up. It's time for our break again. We welcome phone calls. Our TNT lines are always listed at the top of tntradio.live. You can send in questions through my email, my contact form on tntradio.live, or drop them in the chat. We'll be right back.
De-weaponizing weather on today's News Talk Radio, TNT.
Terry, I did have a further comment on your article from your Substack, winterchristian.substack.com, but I missed this comment from Rolo, or Arroyo, I don't know how to pronounce it, sorry, Tomasi, on the chat a couple minutes back, who said, he's asking you the question, Terry. He says, Hrvoje, does Terry think this can be stopped, the road we're being taken down? And that's often a discussion at many of these events that I attend, like Anarchapulco, is you've got, and I think you have to look at multiple things, the belief systems of the people as well. And so I think you'd probably agree with me. I'm assuming, you, Terry, as a Christian, myself, my view is that it's inevitable, but then the other people in the group in the alt media say, oh, you're black pill, blah blah blah, and I'm like, no, we should always keep resisting, like the movie 300, right? To the death, resist tyranny, evil, do good, be nonviolent, even if I believe the Bible. I think it's going to turn out bad eventually. It's going to get progressively worse, but I'm not dejected about it. We get to work, we start fighting back, but then the other people in the alt media movement don't believe in the Bible or God, and they're more optimistic in thinking that we're going to defeat the global occult elite, And I just I have a hard time looking at that. I know we have our battles at times that we succeed in, but they have their hands on all the levers of power and institutions and finance. And even Mercola, Dr. Mercola has come off saying this, that they control almost everything. And so do you think, what your thoughts, Terry? Can we do anything to stop it?
Well, that's pretty much the running theme of my Winter Christian Substack. I'm exploring that right now in many different posts. And I find that the biggest danger when you start thinking of what can we do to stop it is that you're going to latch on to false hope, and you're going to latch on to false leaders. And I would advise people to act as if it is inevitable, but that the details can change. How it plays out could change. And I think the most important thing is which side you're on and what you do to contribute to the resistance, if you want to call it that, before it happens. And so, like in my piece on Alex Jones and David Icke, I talked about Alex Jones writing this book called The Great Awakening. And just on the excerpt of the book where it's advertising it, it talks about how God has this plan for mankind, this glorious future, they call it. Where are they getting that from? I mean, I look at prophecy. I wrote a whole book on Revelation. It's not sunny. It doesn't get better over time if you believe in that. So they're posting this idea. They're floating this idea that God has a glorious future in mind for you. It sounds very much like the QAnon trust the plan sort of thing. It's very much a, go along with these presented saviors that are going to come by. So, I don't know the future. I don't know the timeline of the future, when and if these things will happen. It could be that you can go another 50 years and, have a happy retirement, and then things will happen. But just don't put your faith in institutions, elections, politicians, these things that are going to disappoint you and have this false hope. And I'm totally against revolutionary bloody massacres and domestic terrorism and all these types of extreme ideas that get floated around for how you really solve the problem. This idea of the veteran uprising, to defend the Constitution from enemies, foreign and domestic, and all that kind of stuff. I disown all of that. I have nothing to do with it. I believe in personal salvation. I believe in Jesus Christ being the only savior. And I think that the danger is that as people get more desperate, conditions get worse, they're going to feed you false prophets. They're going to feed you solutions and saviors and these things, knowing that you will want to latch on to it. So that's also part of this sick game that they're playing, is to lure people into these camps and give you this hope, and then that turns out to be a trap.
Yeah, and just to go back to your article where you talk about confidence men and how they pull off their outrageous scams precisely because they know people would rather turn a blind eye to a problem than confront somebody, especially if they act confident. You go on, you talk about also the ultimate example of the Flat Earth movement, which is constantly being debunked and exposed, but is always doubling down on fast talking, gibberish, insults, and false dichotomies. For example, then you must believe everything NASA says. And I had to leave David Weiss's presentation early. He's like the main Flat Earth guy who was speaking today. And honestly, to me, it sounded just as you described it, gibberish. Like he's showing all these videos and stuff. And I have a background as a teacher and a professor, and there is a certain way to present information, step by step, logical, so the student has it clear. And me, as being the student in this Flat Earth lesson, it was just like he's just showing clips. Like it was like gibberish, like the one clip after another, not explaining. I'm like, I don't know what's going on. It's just this and that. And he's talking about the sun, and it's not making any sense. He's not clarifying one point before it moves to another, and it's just rapid fire. The Earth is flat, and it's like.
In my book, Fire in the Rabbit Hole, I talk about David Weiss and he started as a salesman. He's a salesman and a marketing guy who then fell into Santos Bonacci's syncretist society, it's called. It's actually called that. So syncretism is where you believe all religions are the same, essentially. It's very theosophical. He fell into that. He praises Santos Bonacci as being his mentor, and now he's a salesman for that. So he's using salesman techniques, not educational techniques, where you just talk fast, you bombard people. Anytime someone questions you, you make them feel stupid. And then you just sort of have this very charged, emotional sort of language to push people into that. So if people want to see my thoughts on David Weiss, I would love to go there and hear him talk myself. But I write about him in my book, Fire in the Rabbit Hole. I have a whole chapter on the flat Earth, and it is one of these examples. It's exploding in popularity against all odds. You wouldn't think people would be falling for it. But you can see how this cognitive dissonance just sort of overwhelms people's rational instincts, and then they go along with it. And suddenly, once you're in it, now you feel embarrassed to admit that you were fooled. So that becomes cognitive dissonance. I can't admit that I was wrong. And they start by presenting you with all of the things about how NASA is lying, which is a different type of cognitive dissonance. So now you just switch camps. So it's another one of these false solutions where you expose NASA's lying, but then you're supposed to jump into this other camp that also doesn't prove its claims. And so they get you either way. It's an example of steering where people go as they're sort of waking up from the propaganda.
Yeah, and I did listen to David Avocado Wolfe's presentation today, and I like the guy. He's hilarious. I discard his sort of shamanistic, whatever New Age views. He said he was raised as a Baha'i, by the way, which is interesting. He said he's part Persian, but he's really good at health. Like the stuff that he talks about when it comes to detoxing and diet and nutrition and health, it's like, I will take that information and I want to do water fasts as he is doing. He does like 4 2-week water fast, just no food for 2 weeks. He does that 4 times a year. But he also mentioned Rudolf Steiner, who's a key figure, all of these things, this New Age sort of stuff. And he mentioned that a century ago, Steiner said that this sort of flat Earth worldview would be coming back. And so that's just kind of interesting when you examine all these links to this New Age stuff in the background with all of these new alt media theories, there's something there, and very few people are picking that apart. We just got a couple of minutes left, and I did want to get your thoughts, Terry, on this story. Sam Altman and Vision Pro, who says it's the second most impressive technology since the iPhone. I have the means. I can buy the VR thing in my home. Never going to do that. I don't want to use it. I don't want to put something in and get locked in the metaverse. And now people are walking around on the streets with this sort of thing. What do you make of Sam Altman and Vision Pro?
Yeah, Sam Altman is definitely like a DARPA asset, kind of like Elon Musk, and nobody should trust what he says. And so when he comes out, saying how impressive this technology is, but he doesn't say why it's impressive. He's just sort of generically hyping it up. That's a red flag. He, of course, wants people's eyeballs to be scanned, which is exactly what the Vision Pro does. You activate it when you wear it. It activates by scanning your eyes. It has, I think, 16 different cameras in it. Whitney Webb was talking about this and saying how it's basically a walking spy device that not only is it scanning you and your face, it's scanning everybody around you without their permission. And so they can use the biometric information of everybody in public as these people are walking by you. They're capturing your images. It's being stored somewhere, and then it can map out a map of where you were, the timestamps, and who you were around the whole time. So I think the Vision Pro is another piece of military tech designed to spy on people in public and get away with it.
$3,500. Absolutely insane. And I've heard criticism that it's not very well made either. By the way, Whitney Webb will also be speaking at Acapulco virtually, though. So, all right. Always great to chat, Terry. We'll catch up with you next week. Wolfpox.com, winterchristian.substack.com. Everyone go there. Check out Terry's books. Thanks as always.
Thank you very much.
All right, Steve Malzberg is up next. Be seeing you, as Patrick McGoohan would say.